All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Outen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and the legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to today's lunch bite, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation and interpretation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from its headquarters right here at Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Today's lunch bite features Rachel Nellis discussing English writer and historian Catharine Macaulay's An Address to the People of England, Scotland, and Ireland that was published in 1775 as an appeal to Great Britain to change its policies toward its colonies, and that is from our library collections. Rachel Nellis is the Institute's Research Services Librarian, having joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in 2019. She is responsible for facilitating the library's reading room, which you are all sitting in right now, along with the extensive resources within the library collections, including the development and maintenance of the Institute's online digital library. She is a trained archivist and has held many positions in archival work, including the Cosmos Club that is located directly across the street from where you are all sitting today. Now, before I turn things over to Rachel, though, there are a list of housekeeping items that I have to cover for our friends joining us on Zoom this afternoon. Following today's lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Rachel at any point during the presentation by using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those could be submitted by using the chat function, and one of our staff members will do their best to assist you as always with that. So without further delay, please join me in giving Rachel Nellis a very warm welcome.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. So today we'll be talking about Catharine Macaulay. Catharine Sawbridge Macaulay Graham is most well known for her 8-volume History of England, published between 1763 and 1783. As a staunch Republican, Catharine shared the ideals of liberty and republicanism in her writings up until her death in 1791. As a celebrity, Catharine was lauded by many in England and was regarded as one of the best friends Americans had across the Atlantic. Today I'll be sharing about Catharine's only published work on the American crisis from 1775. The second edition, printed in London for Edward and Charles Dilly, is part of our Robert Charles Lawrence Ferguson collection, a collection dedicated to the art of war. The popularity of this vitriolic pamphlet caused it to be printed 4 times in England in quick succession in 1775. So Catharine Sawbridge was born in Kent, England on April 2nd, 1731, to wealthy landowning parents, John Sawbridge and Elizabeth Wanley. Catharine had 3 siblings, Mary, Wanley, and John Sawbridge, who grew up to be a radical politician, a member of Parliament, and mayor of London. Elizabeth, her mother, died in 1733, leaving Catharine and her siblings in the care of a non-present father and a governess for the girls. Catharine and her sisters were not educated in the way her brothers were, and it's often believed that Catharine went on to educate herself by avidly reading through her father's well-stocked library. She was especially fluent in Greek and Roman histories, and she credits these for her devotion to writing history in the introduction to her first published volume. She wrote, "From my early youth, I have read with delight those histories that exhibit liberty in its most exalted state, the annals of the Roman and Greek republics. Studies like these excite the natural love of freedom, which lies latent in the breast of every rational being, till it is nipped by the frost of prejudice or blasted by the influence of vice." Catharine married twice in her lifetime, the first to Dr. George Macaulay in June 1760 until his death in 1766, and a scandalous second marriage to a much younger 21-year-old named William Graham in 1778 when Catharine was 47. Both marriages seemed to be happy and supportive. During her first marriage, Catharine began her career as a historian, publishing her first and second volumes of the eight-volume series History of England in 1763 and 1765. Her publication of Volume 1 made her an overnight celebrity. She was referred to as the celebrated Mrs. Macaulay. While celebrated, her authorship left some uncomfortable with the idea that a woman could and would continue to write history. And of course, these sentiments did not deter her. She kept on writing. Catharine was always outspoken politically. She was associated with John Wilkes and his followers, as well as the Whigs, and strongly favored Republican forms of government. She grew passionate about reform in 1768 after John Wilkes, a radical journalist, was elected as Member of Parliament for Middlesex, expelled by the ministry, and subsequently re-elected 3 times in February, March, and April of 1769. Parliament voided each vote. Wilkes was known for fighting for the rights of his voters to choose their representatives instead of the House of Commons. And John Sawbridge, her brother, was elected to Parliament in the 1768 election for Hythe. With Wilkes's expulsion, Sawbridge took up the cause with his sister by his side. Sawbridge protested Wilkes' expulsion and petitioned the king. Catharine was an active participant in the efforts of parliamentary reform and loudly supported republicanism over monarchical government. She hosted salons attended by English radicals as well as Americans and invited any opportunity to discuss the concerns of the day. Catharine was an avid writer and a rabble-rouser in her prose. In her lifetime, she wrote 16 books, pamphlets, and treatises, all political in nature. Over the course of 20 years, she wrote the 8-volume The History of England from the accession of James I to that of the Brunswick line. This history was another form of defiance and was written in direct Whig opposition to David Hume's Tory History of England. Between writing her history, she wrote political pamphlets that were often responses to those she disagreed with, like Edmund Burke, whom she twice challenged. However, her letters on education from 1790 went on to greatly influence Mary Wollstonecraft, famed writer of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the earliest works written on feminist philosophy. Letters on Education insists that any weaknesses seen in women is due to their miseducation. Catharine published an address to the people of England, Scotland, and Ireland on the present important crisis of affairs at the height of her fame and before the last 3 volumes of the History of England were completed. The pamphlet was an extension of her political views and her first and only public foray into the American crisis. Catharine wrote this piece before anyone had any inkling that the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain would devolve into war. In the early 1770s, her friendship with her publishers, Charles and Edward Dilly, and her political closeness with her brother, John Sawbridge, afforded her introductions into social circles with leading London radicals and American radicals, including John and Abigail Adams, Benjamin Rush, and Mercy Otis Warren. She was in correspondence with many Americans at this time, as the situation in America continued to worsen. This correspondence served more than friendship. People like John Adams were receiving information about Parliament from Catharine and her various friends in government. In correspondence between Abigail Adams and Catharine in 1774, Adams describes the dire situation in the colonies after the passing of the Intolerable Acts, writing, "A cause, madam, which has now become so serious to every American that we consider it as a struggle from which we shall obtain a release from our present bondage by an ample redress of our grievances, or redress by the sword. The only alternative which every American thinks of is liberty or death. Should I attempt to describe to you the complicated miseries and distresses brought upon us by the late inhuman acts of the British Parliament, my pen would fail me. Suffice it to say that we are invaded with fleets and armies, our commerce not only obstructed, but totally ruined, the courts of justice shut, many driven out from the metropolis, thousands reduced to want or dependent upon the charity of their neighbors for a daily supply of food. All the horrors of a civil war threatening us on one hand, and the chains of slavery ready forged for us on the other. Likewise, Mercy Otis Warren wrote to Catharine in December of 1774 with more detail than Abigail, expressing anger over the mistreatment and predicting bloodshed if things accelerated. She wrote, "Will not succeeding generations be astonished when told that this maritime city was blockaded at a period when her commercial interests were closely interwoven with those of Britain? But though America stands armed with resolution and virtue, she still recoils at the thought of drawing the sword against the state from whence she derived her origin, though that state, like an unnatural parent, has plunged her dagger into the bosom of her affectionate offspring. The Boston Port Bill occasions such a stagnation of commerce as is felt in every villa of Massachusetts. The legislative body is preventing meeting, the executive officers rendered incapable of acting, and the courts of justice shut up. Heaven only knows how long we can continue in this state. Will you pardon me, madam, if I own that my apprehensions are sometimes awake, lest Britain should be infatuated enough to push the unhappy Americans to the last appeal? I behold the civil sword brandished over our heads and an innocent land drenched in blood." The pamphlet has been described as one of the most vigorous and inflammatory attacks on the government of George III penned during the 1770s. It served as a warning to the people of England, Scotland, and Ireland that they were in danger of parliamentary oppression, similar to what they had already done to the Americans to effectively strip them of their rights. Catharine was disturbed by the passing of the Intolerable Acts as a result of the 1773 Boston Tea Party. The 5 acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act, as well as the Quebec Act, effectively dismantled colonial trade, representative government, and the right to a fair trial. These acts spurred the Continental Congress to meet in 1774 and created union among the colonies. The acts were not repealed and led to the start of war in 1775. In 27 pages, Catharine, with the backdrop of the Intolerable Acts, attempts to convince her countrymen that the American cause was also their cause. Englishmen were in danger of oppression and of Parliament stripping them of their rights if they didn't act now to help the colonists. You can see the shared ideas from Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren within the text. Catharine lays out her argument with a number of different examples. She denounces the British government and their repressive actions and acts, writing, "With an entire supineness, England, Scotland, and Ireland have seen the Americans year by year stripped of the most valuable of their rights, and to the eternal shame of this country, the Stamp Act, by which they were to be taxed in an arbitrary manner, found no opposition, except from those who are particularly concerned that the commercial intercourse between Great Britain and her colonies should meet with no interruption. With the same guilty acquiescence, my countrymen, ye have seen the last Parliament finish their venal course, with passing 2 acts for shutting up the port of Boston, for indemnifying the murders of the inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay, and changing their chartered constitution of government, and to shew that none of the fundamental principles of our boasted constitution are held sacred by the government of the people, the same Parliament, without any interruption, either by petition or remonstrance, passed another act for changing the government of Quebec." She looks back to the Wilkes affair and encourages her brethren to fight for parliamentary reform in England. She writes, "It is not to be supposed that either the beauty of justice, the interests of liberty, or the welfare of individuals, as united to the common good, can have any avail with men who, at this important crisis of British affairs, could reject the wise example set them by the city of London and the county of Middlesex in requiring a test from those they elected into the representative office. A test which, had it been generally taken and religiously observed, would have dispersed the dark cloud which hangs over the empire, restored the former splendor of the nation, and given a renewed strength, vigor, and purity to the British Constitution." The pamphlet also discusses the taxation of the colonies and the recommendation of conciliatory trade policies during a section featuring a section directly quoted from James Berg's Political Disquisitions, published in London in 1774, and a reference to Reverend Jonathan Shipley, Bishop of St. Asaph. Both were publications that Catharine thought very highly of, and Berg's Political Disquisitions was also published by her publishers, the Dilleys. In a September 11th, 1774 postscript of a letter to John Adams, Catharine wrote, "I have just read the Bishop of St. Asaph's speech on the affairs of America and think it is one of the most capital performances I have seen of modern times." She's referencing his work, a speech intended to have been spoken by the Bishop of St. Asaph on the bill for altering the charter of the colony of Massachusetts Bay. In her address, she writes, "The Bishop of St. Asaph, who speaks on the subject in a manner which must convince every man whose prejudices are only founded in ignorance, he is of opinion that the most beneficial way of taxing the colonies is obliging them to an exclusive commerce with us." For James Berg, she uses 2.5 pages of her pamphlet to directly quote his work, writing, "I shall now give you some of the judicious observations of one of your best friends in regard to the conduct of your government towards America." And she quotes Berg, "We have treated our colonies worse than conquered countries. Neither Wales nor Ireland are taxed, unheard, and unrepresented in the British Parliament as the colonies. Wales sends members of Parliament, and Ireland has done so. And as Ireland not now represented in the British Parliament, neither is it taxed in the British Parliament." Catharine also predicts, but does not condone, civil war between the colonies and Great Britain. She feels strongly that if there is a civil war, Americans will become independent. If a civil war commences between Great Britain and her colonies, either the mother country, by one great exertion, may ruin both herself and America, or the Americans, by a lingering contest, will gain an independency. And whilst a new, a flourishing, and an extensive empire of free men is established on the other side of the Atlantic, you, with the loss of all those blessings you have received by the unrivaled state of your commerce, will be left to the bare possession of your foggy islands, and this under the imperious sway of a domestic despot, or you'll become the provinces of some powerful European state." She warns that civil war would result in England being at odds with Spain and France, who would ally with Americans. Then you will become an easy prey to the courts of France and Spain, who you may depend upon it, will fall upon you as soon as they see you fairly engaged in a war with your colonists. And according to what is foretold you in a late publication, that conjecture will prove the latest and the uttermost of your prosperity, your peace, and in all probability of your existence as an independent state and nation. Catharine ends her work with encouragement to her fellow countrymen to stand up for their rights and all their brethren. "Rouse, my countrymen, rouse from what state of guilty dissipation in which you have too long remained, and in which you longer continue, you are lost forever. Rouse, and unite in one general effort, till by your unanimous and repeated addresses to the throne and to both houses of Parliament, you draw the attention of every part of the government to their own interests, and so the dangerous state of the British Empire." Catharine's publishing partners, Edward and Charles Dilly, were influential in the proliferation of her work and the work of other radicals of the time. Edward, the oldest of the two brothers, was a great friend to the American cause and ran in the same Whig circles as Catharine and her brother. The Dillys would host radicals, authors, friends, and patrons to discuss politics and books. John Wilkes would be seen at the Dillys for dinner along with Catharine, and this is where Catharine made the acquaintance of Benjamin Rush for the first time. And John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were also among the American friends that visited the Dillys. The Dillys began publishing Catharine's books after the 5th volume of history was printed. An address was published on January 13th, 1775, and immediately sent out to bookshops and patrons, including John Adams. Edward Dilly wrote to Adams on January 13th that he had sent 4 copies of a small pamphlet published this day by Mrs. Macaulay on the present important crisis of affairs. This lady, though in a very infirm state of health, could not refrain throwing in her mite into the public treasury. Dilly also served as a messenger on many occasions for Catharine, bundling her letters with his to America. In a September 24th, 1774 letter, Dilly wrote to John Adams, "Enclosed I send you 2 letters from Mrs. Macaulay, one for yourself and the other for Mrs. Warren. She has been much indisposed for many months past, but is now much better, and I hope will be able to soon go on with her work. America has not got 2 warmer friends in this country than Mrs. Macaulay and her own brother, Mr. Alderman Sawbridge." In this letter, Dilly also notes sending along Berg's 2nd volume of Political Disquisitions and a few copies of the Bishop of St. Asaph's intended speech upon the bill for altering the charters. Again, both referenced in Catharine's address as well. So after the war in 1784, Catharine toured the United States with her 2nd husband, William Graham, for a year-long visit. During her tour, she at long last met many of her correspondents in person, including the Adamses, Benjamin Rush, Mercy Otis Warren, and Richard Henry Lee. Near the end of her travels abroad, Catharine and her husband were honored with a 10-day stay at Mount Vernon with George and Martha Washington. During this time, Washington shared his military records with Catharine, and this stay cemented a friendship between Washington and Catharine as they continued to correspond long after 1784. Washington later wrote Richard Henry Lee in June of 1785 about Catharine, writing, "I am obliged to you for introducing a lady to me whose reputation among the literati is so high, and whose principles are so much and so justly admired by the friends to liberty and of mankind." Her travels through the United States also revived her pamphlet that was nearly a decade old. Corresponding with her stay in Massachusetts, an address was reprinted in 3 installments in October 1784 in the Boston newspaper American Herald. Many Americans were hopeful that Catharine would pen a history of the American Revolution, in particular to shed positive light on the new nation. However, growing old and often ill, Catharine did not write the history. Instead, her good friend, Mercy Otis Warren, influenced by Catharine to become a historian, became one of the first American female historians with the publication of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution in 1805. Catharine continued to write up until her death in 1791 at the age of 60. Her last pamphlet, Observations on the Reflections of the Right Honorable Edmund Burke on the Revolution in France, was published in 1790 to defend the burgeoning French Revolution, and she died hopeful that the French Republic would succeed. I think that's it. So, questions?
Yes, I mean, I just don't think of a woman of that time as being having so much access, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how did that work? I mean, I'm just thinking even in terms of, so perhaps the library of her family was extensive, but still that's not enough. You need to go other places and you need to interact with other people. And so how did that work? How did one do that in her time and her society? You know, did you need to be accompanied? Did you have to, I don't know, have your calling card? I don't know how that worked.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just think, then also talking about correspondence that she had after the war with George Washington. Is that correspondence,
Down the street?
I have to tell you, this is not something I've ever been.
Well, thank you for that question. The question was basically, how did Catherine or maybe other women in general kind of stay connected and get into these different social and political circles? So I'm very familiar with Mercy Otis Warren as well, and I would say both of these women had the advantage of, one, being well educated, whether by themselves or through a governess or something, and two, they were both politically they both had siblings or people close to them that were in the political world or the literary world. So I think having those people really helped them get their foot in the door. And once they began writing, people realized that they had something to say and wanted to be in correspondence with them or just wanted to hear them speak and things like that. So I do think they really benefited from their familial connections in that way. Her brother was a politician. Mercy Otis Warren's brother was a politician. So it just all kind of connects that way. And then your question about Washington and kind of where any of that correspondence would be. I think Mount Vernon does have a couple Macaulay letters, but I know her letters seem to be kind of scattered in a lot of different places. Mass Historical has a number of them. They're kind of just all over. And what I think is interesting about Catherine is by the end of 1774, she thought her mail was being tampered with. So I think like later in 1775, she and a lot of other English radicals just kind of stopped sending mail in general to the States, or if they did, they were packaged with books or other things. So I'm actually not even sure how much other correspondence exists from those war years like that, which is interesting to think about. So, yes.
Did any of these English radicals reference slavery in any way?
I don't know if in my research for this project, I did not come across anything, which makes sense because this is more about like parliamentary reform and things like that. But I mean, they certainly could have been talking about that in other correspondence. Yes.
You mentioned the kind of excessive reprintings of this while in England, and then you mentioned it being printed in America after the war. But do you know whether or not this was printed in America either before, like when it was published in 1775, or during the course of the war?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like after those 4 editions in England, I think there were a couple that were printed in the States as well, which makes sense. I think it was probably more well read in the United States. And I think people here probably found it more interesting in general. So, but it was printed in the United States as well after the London editions.
Follow-up to that would be, my follow-up to that would be, you talked about her kind of rise in fame, and given that it was so widely printed in England, I'm curious what the kind of general reception of this was in England when it was printed. I mean, obviously it was popular if it was reprinted that many times, but the historian brain in me says reprinting doesn't equate acceptance.
Yeah.
It could have been reprinted because of kind of the scandal of it all. So I'm curious what the reception was.
Yeah. So what was the reception of the pamphlet in England, especially due to it being reprinted so many times? You know, I haven't found much about the actual reception of it. My guess would be that the radicals loved it. It was speaking to everything they were trying to achieve. And I'm sure she definitely had some political enemies. So I'm sure the other side of the aisle didn't like it and probably didn't interact with it very much, would be my guess. But I really haven't found much about English reception of it, like as a whole, unfortunately. Yes. Okay, so the first question is, would there be any positive to basically aggregating all of her works into one place? Yeah, I think there would be. I think she had a lot to say, and all of her pamphlets are covering just totally different topics, and it probably is all aggregated in one place, would be my guess, or at least I know Michigan has that wonderful digital library where I was actually using their online version of her address for that, and I think they already have some more of her works on there as well. But I think if it has not been done, it should be done. And then what was the second question again? Oh, relatives. Does she have any living descendants? So she did have one daughter, but that's as far as I got with that genealogy. So she could certainly, but I'm really not sure.
I found it interesting that at least in your presentation, she tended to address her countrymen and gentlemen, and most of mostly men. Did you run across, I mean, did she ever write to her countrymen and countrywomen, for instance, or appear to address other women at any time?
The question was, she uses like countrymen a lot. So did she ever write directly to like countrymen and countrywomen, and things like that? Her public writings, I've really only seen like countrymen and brethren and things like that, which I feel like that was also probably just a formal way of writing back then in general. And unfortunately, I'm sure more men were reading her works than women were at the time, just with the state of education and things like that. So I feel like that's also maybe an all-around term, but yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it probably was. I really didn't think a lot about this in my research, so now I think I have to a little bit more. Andrew? So did her husband travel with her to Mount Vernon? William Graham was on her 1784 to 1785 tour of the United States. I am assuming he was also at Mount Vernon. My assumption is that he was with her for most of her travels abroad, so. So is there more information on the visit to Mount Vernon? I did not delve too far into that besides her brief meeting with him and getting to go through his military papers, which is really interesting, I think, that he let her do that. There probably is more information on that visit, and I would guess that Mount Vernon might have more information on that visit as well, since that's where she was, but I personally do not have more. How many meetings did Catherine have with Mercy Otis Warren? I am not sure how many times they actually met in person, but I know their correspondence is vast. There are actually some books of correspondence between them, and yeah, I mean, I think they were writing to each other as much as they could. But as far as in person, I'm not sure. Probably not that many visits in person. So was she a friend of Lafayette? Did she talk about Lafayette, talk to Lafayette? Again, I actually don't know. I was wondering about this near the end of my research and didn't get into it, but yeah, I really am not sure. I think that'd be something simple to look up though, that maybe I'll do after this. Okay. All right, I think, yes. Yeah, so this talk was recorded, so it'll be available on our YouTube, I think, in a few weeks or so. So for those in person, I do have her address on the table in front of you here. We actually only have her address in our library. We don't have her other publications, though I'm glad to see we do have James Berg's Political Disquisitions in our collection as well, and the St. Asaph's speech that she references a lot in her address too. But so the original of the address is here for you to look at if you're in person. And then a number of other libraries have a mishmash of her works as well. So probably, I'm pretty sure they do. Yeah. All right. Well, great. Thank you.